Okay, we're doing this series on what's a realistic view of recovery. What does it take realistically to get clean and sober and stay that way? And recently we've switched into what are the attitudes that you need in order to make it in recovery. So last week we started the attitude of forgiveness, and I said it's such a misunderstood topic that I wanted to do it over 2 nights. So last week we talked about the resentment part. What is a resentment? And again, there's lots of misunderstandings around that. So tonight I want to do what is forgiveness. And most people in recovery at some point in time realize that if they don't get rid of resentments and let them go, their chances of staying clean and sober are pretty small. And so forgiveness becomes such an important part of moving forward in recovery. And so a lot of people, though, know they got resentments, they just don't know what to do, and there's so much confusion around it that a lot of people get misled about this subject. And so I hope tonight I can explain and clarify stuff for you. Now I want to say 2 things up front. First of all, I have found that for most people, one of their greatest resentments is towards themselves. And so the person that is hardest for them to forgive is themselves. And so I'm going to talk about that, or you can have it in your thinking as we work through what it means to forgive. The second thing is a lot of people, when they talk about forgiveness, they make it sound like it's really simple to do. Like, just forgive the person, be done with it. What I've realized is forgiveness is super hard. And it takes a lot of courage, and it takes a lot of time. And so I in no way want to minimize forgiveness as something that is simple or easy. It is very, very challenging. So I want to begin what forgiveness isn't. Because I think that's where we need to start with clarifying what forgiveness is. So what forgiveness isn't is, first of all, many of you have heard growing up, forgive and forget. And you're made to think that if you forgave somebody, you would magically forget all about all that pain. Well, you probably realize through experience that that is a lie. You just don't forgive and forget. You can forgive and still remember, but still forgive. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to clarify. Secondly, a lot of people fear that what I'm saying about forgiving is that I just say, oh yeah, that wasn't a big deal. So minimize that it was bad, minimize that it was painful, minimize that it was wrong, and just say, get over it. And a lot of you grew up hearing that. Quit making such a big deal out of things. What I'm saying and what we're going to say about forgiveness is we're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to say it was a real big deal. So forgiveness doesn't mean making light of it or minimizing it at all. Second, the next thing is a lot of people fear that if they forgive somebody, what we're saying is you have to invite them back into your life like they were before. And say, welcome back in, no boundaries. And what we're going to see is you can forgive somebody and say, sorry, buddy, you're not going to be in my life. So forgiveness doesn't erase boundaries. Forgiveness keeps boundaries and often creates new, healthier boundaries. With that, a lot of people fear that when you say forgive a person, you're saying trust them again. We're not saying that at all. So those are misconceptions and fears that people have when it comes to this idea of forgiving somebody else. Another one is, and this is where some confusion starts. Some people think that if you forgive a person, you'll never get angry about it. That all of a sudden, if you ever get angry again, people say, well, you didn't forgive them, you must still have a resentment. And what I want you to see is you can forgive somebody, but still get really angry about what happened. So we're going to clarify that as well. And then there's another angle on it. A lot of people fear or think or wish, maybe is a better way to say it, that if I just forgive people, then that'll magically fix all the hurts of my life. And I won't have to do any work on myself. I'll just say, I forgive you, and then everything will be fixed. No, what happens for most people is you forgive them, then you got to do a ton of work. Because you still got wounded. You still got a lot of damage there that has to be worked through. So forgiveness is not a magic pill, so you don't have to work on yourself. Okay? So let's switch to what forgiveness is. And there's 3 things that I want you to understand about it. A basic definition, number 1, is forgiveness is giving up the right to wrong a person back who's wronged me. So it's giving up the right to take revenge, to take justice into my own hands. And another way to say it is, you hurt me, but I'm going to cancel the debt of paying you back. Now, what that means, if you take that further, and this is where the courage comes in, is when I forgive a person, what I say is, I will absorb the pain that you caused me and not put it back on you. So it's going to end with me. So instead of trying to vent backwards at you, I will absorb it. And that's where it takes courage and strength to be willing to do that. Because if you don't, then it's just, I'll pay you back, and then they got to pay you back for paying them back, and then you got to pay them back, and it never ends. Forgiveness says it ends here. No more paybacks are going to happen. Next thing I want you to understand is this. Forgiveness is a decision that is made at one point in time that you then repeat thousands and thousands of times. So I can think to many times when I've been hurt and I say, I forgive that person, and then 5 minutes later I think of something else they did. And all that anger comes back up and I got to forgive them again. And then 10 minutes later, another thought comes into my mind and it all comes back and I got to let it go again. So it is a one-time commitment followed by a repetition over and over again. And you know what I have found in my life? For the deepest hurts, it can take up to 3 or 4 years till you're finally able to move past it totally. And it's a long journey for deep hurts. That leads to the third thing. There's a process that takes place within that journey. So let me give you the parts of the process. There's no magical order for these. There's no magical length of time for each stage. You can go through it, but anybody that gets hurt deeply will go through a process in trying to resolve that hurt, get through it, heal from it, and move on. So number 1 is you begin with a state of shock. You almost are like, I can't get my head around this. What just happened here? And so your brain wants to go either, I'm going to deny that this happened, I'm going to minimize that this happened, but I am in this place of not sure what to do with it. It's too big for my brain to handle. And many of you can relate to that. So you get that shocked state. Now, the danger of that is that for many of you growing up, what happened then was your parents gave you a tool that said, quit making such a big deal out of it. They did not validate the pain. They minimized it. They said, you're just making that up. They denied it. It's all in your head. And they made you feel bad for your first reaction of hurt and shock. So that leads to the second step, which is the healthy tool for healing from a hurt and forgiving, and that is you got to honor your pain. You have to be able to validate and not minimize, this hurts, I was hurt. Now, some of you may need a person in your life to run that by. Because what you hear as soon as you say, I'm hurt, your brain says you're making too big a deal out of it. You should just get over this, quit. You're always super sensitive. All of those kind of things start playing in your head. And so you don't know, am I making too big a deal out of this? Or am I realistic to feel this way? And you might need somebody in your life that can say, no, you were hurt and you're right in the way you're validating it. So honor your pain. Now I want to read you a quote that I came across that I thought says it very well. Okay. The avoidance of pain increases it. So your limbic brain says, I'm in pain, let's avoid it. That will make me feel better. But in reality, you're only making it worse in the long run. So the avoidance of pain increases it. To heal, you must pass through the doorway of grief. Emotional wounds are beyond sadness. They're felt in the depths of your being. Honor your pain. Don't run from it. In other words, the first step of healing is to honor your pain. Now, there's some dangers that go with that. Some of you honor your pain and then you decide to pitch a tent there and camp there for a while and become a victim. And that's not a good solution. And so a lot of people, when they first honor their pain, then people feel sorry for them and validate and comfort them, and they go, I kind of like this. Let's honor my pain longer and get more sympathy. So you got to honor your pain, but not slide into a victim mentality. And then you might have to talk to somebody to get that out. So forgiveness is not about denying pain. Forgiveness is not about denying wrongdoing. It's a choice to let go of the person, not the pain that hurt you. You honor that pain, and then because you honor it, you face it honestly, and then you can heal. It's interesting to me what they're finding out about our brains is you can't heal from a problem until you admit it. Once you bring it to a conscious level and see it accurately, then you can heal, and only then. And that goes against complex trauma families, which minimize, deny, blame, rationalize. And so this is a brand new way of looking at it. So that's the second step. Then the next thing is an anger. So the pain, the hurt is registering. You're owning it, and it is pissing you off. That hurt, that was wrong. Anger is part of forgiveness. Anger is part of the healing process. Now, the danger in complex trauma is you can get addicted to that anger. And you want to stay angry because when you're angry, you don't feel the pain. When you're angry, all kinds of different things happen. But anger is an important part of the process. So don't be afraid of that. You want to know what I do as a counselor when somebody says I've forgiven somebody? I begin to explore to see if they ever were angry. Because if they weren't angry and I know that a bad hurt happened, then I go, they didn't really deal with this problem. They're just denying it or minimizing it. And so one of the things I'm looking for to make sure a person's really dealt with an issue and really has found forgiveness is, have they allowed themselves to be angry? Next thing I want you to be aware of. When I work with people who have been deeply hurt and they're angry, I let them be angry for a while, and then I always do this. Tell me, what is the pain you feel under the anger? Because if we can get to that, then we can start to heal. So anger, yes, you go through that, but it's got to take you to the pain under it. And that's where people go, I feel betrayed. I feel disrespected. I feel rejected. I go, now we're getting to the root issue and we can heal from that. And then I want people to also be aware that they probably have other emotions besides anger. So I ask them some of the other emotions that they might be feeling. So they feel those other hurts, but then they might be depressed. This is really making them sad. Or they might be full of anxiety and fear about what am I going to do now moving forward, and can I deal with this problem? Others, they go through a time of feeling hopeless. Life is too much. This sucks. I just don't know if I can keep going. So I want them to tap in to the other emotions and validate what else is going on inside of them. And then we go from the emotional world to the intellectual world. When you get hurt, your brain first is shock, and then it goes to, why did this happen to me? And it begins to try and figure it out. And it goes, am I to blame? Did I do something wrong? Is it all their stuff? And you start this analyzing, replaying over and over, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand it. People who are very analytical and logical, they can get stuck here because they want it all figured out perfectly. And you might not be able to do that. The other danger a lot of people have is that they start to obsess. They can't sleep because they're replaying and replaying and replaying, and they don't know how to turn it off. So there's a place for figuring it out. Your brain needs to try to resolve it and understand it, but you can get stuck there, and it can go to an unhealthy thing. And then you're not sleeping, you're getting more negative, more dark, and it's not a pretty thing. So again, having a person you can talk to is often important in this stage. Next, you reach a point where you say, this happened, I can't go back and redo it. So I just have to accept this is part of my life, this is who I am. And then I choose to forgive. I'm not going to go and let that anger turn sour and bitter and fester away and just think of revenge. I am going to choose to not do that. Now that, like I said, it's a choice that you just repeat and repeat. But here's the part I want you to get. Do you realize that in the beginning, forgiveness is not an emotion? Forgiveness is a choice. You want to know, I think a lot of people, why they get confused is this. They go, if I start feel forgiveness feelings towards a person, then I'll forgive them. Do you realize you'll never feel those feelings until you choose to forgive? And then the feelings will come later. So in the beginning, don't be looking for a forgiveness emotion. Forgiveness is a choice, not an emotion. And that is so important to understand. Then once those thoughts pop back into your head, and they will, and the deeper they're hurt, the more often they're going to pop back into your head, don't feed them. Don't go into, I'll just take 5 seconds to just think about how I'm going to get back at them and kill them without getting caught and all that stuff. As soon as you do that, you're feeding it. And then that 5 seconds is 5 minutes and 5 hours of planning your revenge. Don't feed it. So part of the choice to forgive is a choice to not feed it when the thoughts keep popping into my head. Now that's hard. And if you've been hurt badly, and all of you have, you understand how hard it is. Next, I always laugh because people will come and see me and they say, okay, I'm choosing to forgive that person. And then they will come to Finding Freedom and see that person. And I just watch them in their chair. They're just fidgety. And then at break time, they're outside just giving it to them. And I go, okay, once you get the thought, you don't feed the thought, but you don't act on it either. You don't send them a nice little thing on Facebook about how, without using their name, of course, about what a loser they are. You don't do anything to act on a revenge type thing. That's tough. And that takes a lot of time. And then the final part is after you've done that wound, which you once saw as just a negative in your life that messed you up, you get to a place where you begin to reintegrate all of that pain. And you begin to see that thing that was such a negative, I've learned so many lessons from it. It's changed me into a better person because I forgave and learned from it. And now I'm able to help others who go through the same thing. If you look at people who do specialized type programs, a lot of them do it because they were once there. And that negative has become a positive and a platform from which they help other people. About 30 some years ago, Kim and I went through a very painful time where my reputation was taken by a few people and they just spread all kinds of negative stuff that wasn't true. And it resulted in losing a job. It resulted in lots of pain. And from day one, we said, we choose to forgive these people. Now, that was a choice. We sure didn't feel it. We were hurt. We were angry. We were fearful about what was going to happen. Every 5 minutes for the first few weeks, it was a struggle just to let it go, let it go, let it go. Don't feed it, don't feed it. And gradually it got a little bit easier. And I look back on that now, and that, I'm thankful for what happened. I hated it at the time. It was so difficult, but so much good has come out of that. You realize I wouldn't be in Winnipeg if that hadn't happened? There would be no Finding Freedom if that hadn't happened. All of this stuff, as my life moved forward, I looked back and said that was part of the key pieces that resulted in today. And that is what can happen once you forgive, learn from it, reintegrate. You reach a point where you look back and go, I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but I'm thankful that it happened. Now, I got to go to the next thing. Some people say, this forgiveness stuff, is there any scientific evidence that it's good? Yes, there is. And that's fascinating again to me, is that the more research that's being done around these kind of things, we can actually look in the brain and see what's happening when people have resentments and when they forgive. And so more and more scientific evidence is coming out that forgiveness is a very good thing. So I'm going to give you 3 studies. One was a forgiveness study out of the University of Wisconsin, and they said that people who develop an ability to forgive have greater control over their emotions, are significantly less angry, upset, and hurt, and are much healthier. It is easier for them to move forward into a purposeful future when you've truly forgiven. And they've done thousands of people that were involved in this study. Then the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, people who focused on a grudge have elevated blood pressure and heart rates, as well as increased muscle tensions and feelings of being less in control. So forgiveness, lower blood pressure, less muscle fatigue, pain, and feeling more in control of your life. And then Dr. Caroline Leaf, who is a neurobiologist that's done 30 years of research on the brain, they have found that your brain is like a tree. And it grows and puts out all these little branches as you get new experiences, new information. And you can see on the left there, that's the brain as it develops. And it looks like a forest of trees. Look on the right. See that toxic brain? That's a resentment brain. So whenever you get toxic thoughts like I hate everybody, or I hate myself, or I am just full of shame, I'm full of fear, your brain isn't able to develop in a healthy way. Your brain looks like a barren tree. And so what they're able to see now is that when a person has a resentment, it creates a toxic thought and it does brain damage. Forgiveness begins to let the brain heal and develop into that forest that it was designed to be. Now, I've got to give you a final illustration. Some of you might think this a little bit crude, but I kind of like it. If you've been in counseling, you've probably heard the word catharsis. So if a person has a really good cry and they pour out their heart, we say that was a cathartic experience. And the word catharsis comes from a Greek word that means something that purifies your emotions. And what it's recognizing is your emotions have toxic parts to them and healthy parts. And so when you have a toxic emotion, you need a good cry and a good purifying of your emotions to get all that toxic stuff out. So guess what word we get from catharsis? A catheter. Now, if you've ever had a catheter, you know how unpleasant that is. But when you can't pee on your own, they stick up a catheter. Why? Because if you get too much toxic stuff inside of you, it'll kill you. So they put a catheter to drain all the toxic waste from your body. So take that a little bit further. Everything that has input, a car has gasoline, a human body, we eat food. What happens when we burn that energy? It creates an exhaust. It creates fumes. It creates toxic waste. And so in a car, you have an exhaust system to get rid of that toxic waste, because if you don't, you die of carbon monoxide poisoning. In a human body, we pee and poo, and that gets rid of all that toxic waste. Guess what we need in our emotional world? In the body and in a car, if you don't eliminate the toxic waste, something bad's going to happen. What comes out of complex trauma? An emotional world full of toxic waste. A lot of that comes out of resentments. A lot of that comes out of anger and bitterness and fear and hate. And so what forgiveness is providing is a catheter, a catharsis, a way of eliminating and purifying all of those toxic emotions from your system so you can get healthier. If you don't have that catharsis in your emotional world, if you hang on to all those resentments, you will get sicker and sicker and sicker. And that's what the University of Wisconsin and the Mayo Clinic research is showing. People who hang on to resentments and don't forget get sicker physically, emotionally, and spiritually, and relationally. It always has a negative effect. Forgiveness lets that toxic waste get released. So that's the importance, the value of forgiveness. Second half, we always talk about the first half from a Christian perspective. And this forgiveness thing is talked about a lot in the Bible. So I thought the angle I want to come from is this. One of the statements I hear on a fairly regular basis from people who come in to React, Finding Freedom, become Christians, is they go, I don't know if God can forgive me. He might be able to forgive lots of people for lots of things, but if you knew the stuff I did, I don't know that God could forgive me. And I hear that a lot. And it's like in their mind, God forgives a certain amount of badness, but once the badness gets too bad, it's even beyond what he would forgive. And so over the years, I've done lots of thinking about how do I help people process that concern. Because what I think happens for a lot of people is in their mind somewhere, subconsciously or consciously, is I think God's mad at me. I think God can't forgive me unless he makes me suffer for a while. So I'll help God out by beating myself up for a couple years, and then maybe I'll earn his forgiveness or I'll pay off some of my bad stuff, and then I can get forgiven. And so how do I help people process that? So I thought tonight I would take you to another event from Jesus' death. So last week we talked about Jesus being betrayed by Judas and denied by Peter, and Jesus having the supper with them and forgiving both of those guys. Tonight I want to take you to what happened at the crucifixion. And what I want you to do is this. Once I entered the world of complex trauma and began to understand complex trauma, it really affected how I read the Bible. And so what I want you to do is put your complex trauma hat on tonight, and we're going to look at this part of the Bible through the eyes of complex trauma, and hopefully it'll help you get a bigger appreciation for this part of the Bible. So I'm going to read it to you. It says, 2 other men were crucified with Jesus. So both were criminals. They were led out to be executed with him. When they came to the place called the Skull, they nailed Jesus to the cross, and the criminals were also crucified, one on his right and one on his left. Jesus said, so Jesus has gone through all this suffering. He's been beaten, he's been whipped, crucified, made fun of, an illegal trial, lots of injustice, one wrong after another, one hurt after another. And as he's hanging on the cross, he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. One of the criminals hanging there started to scoff. And he said, so you're the Messiah, are you? And that word meant the king. You're the king, are you? Prove it to yourself and to us too by saving yourself and us too while you're at it. In other words, if you're such a hot shot, get down off the cross. If you're who you say you are, this shouldn't be happening to you. So they're making fun of him, or this one criminal is. But then the other criminal protested, and he said, don't you fear God? He's talking to the other criminal. Don't you fear God even when you've been sentenced to die too? We deserve to die for our crimes, but this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, and he turns to Jesus, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus replied, I assure you, today you will be with me in paradise. Now, I want you to understand the word that's used for a criminal or a robber. So the word that's used isn't somebody that's a petty theft type of person. So it's not just a casual thief. It's a person who purposely has made a life of plundering and hurting people. So that's become their occupation. They are a career criminal, so they have no regard for humans. They just use humans. They don't mind hurting humans as long as they get what they want. So I've worked with a lot of criminals. I've worked with thousands of people in complex trauma. How does a person get to a point where they can shut down their conscience and just hurt people and it doesn't even faze them? Some of you can relate to some of that. And to understand complex trauma, it just starts adding meaning to this. So here's what I've seen has to happen inside of a person to become that kind of a criminal. So number one, at some point in their growing up, they said having a conscience and feeling guilt just means more pain. If you try to fix your guilt, you only get hurt worse, only bad things happen. So I'm tired of feeling pain, I'm going to shut her down. And they harden their conscience, they harden their heart to survive because there's so much pain in their life. Then when they find crime, there's an adrenaline rush and they get addicted to the rush. It's not so much about the crime, it's the rush of the crime. That becomes a thing that makes them feel energy, it makes them feel alive, it gives them a high. And then they're people that in order to survive, they had to blame everybody else for where they're at in life. They can't own that they've made decisions that have brought them here. They blame everybody, God included, for where they're at. And in their mind, that justifies them being where they're at. And then they have all kinds of ways to rationalize what they're doing. I remember the first time we had a fellow as a client who was a career criminal, and his specialty was burglary. And he said this with all seriousness, I have never robbed a home. I only rob businesses. And I go, okay, he's saying it's all right to rob businesses, all right, not all right to rob homes. So I said, why do you make that distinction? He says businesses have insurance, so it doesn't really cost them anything. And he had rationalized in his mind that it was okay to rob businesses because they have insurance, but he would never rob a family because they might not have insurance. So that's what you got to do in order to live in that kind of thing and not have a conscience. You got to rationalize it all. And then the next thing that you do is instead of looking at yourself and maybe the problems there, you find flaws in everybody else. And you make your focus tearing people down and looking down on people. And so you find a way to make yourself better than everybody else and to look down on them. And then you got to add anger to that mix, because if you're angry all the time, you don't feel. If you're angry all the time, you can justify stuff and feel righteous about it because you're angry. If you're angry all the time, you can blame everybody. So anger becomes an important thing. Then you have to somehow still make yourself feel okay about what you're doing. And so you ridicule laws. And you say they're stupid, they're dumb, and you find little things about laws that you can find fault with just so you can disregard it all. And then you have to flaunt your criminality in the sense that I'm proud of the lifestyle I've chosen. I'm one of the bad boys. I am in an elite class. And you do all of that mental gymnastics to make yourself feel better about your life. And then one other thing that usually is part of all of this is you need others who are with you in this, who support you, who pat you on the back, who give you a certain amount of respect for what you're doing. You know what's interesting about these two criminals is a lot of historians feel that they were part of a gang, and in Israel at that time there was a gang led by a man named Barabbas, and it was one of the worst gangs in that part of the world. And so they feel that these men were part of that gang who spent their life robbing and killing and doing all kinds of things in that gang type of way. So if you can build a brotherhood where you all pat each other on the back, that helps you feel better about it too. So did you see what just happened there as we looked at that criminal through complex trauma? You begin to see all the layers that we put into place to justify what's going on inside of us. Even though at a deep, deep level, we know it's not right. Now the question becomes, when a person is in such deep denial and they will never look honestly at themselves, but have found multitude of ways of avoiding looking honestly at themselves, what does it take to get a person to finally get honest? A whole lot of pain. Now, it's interesting because you look at two criminals, both got the same amount of pain, and do you notice that one just got even more hard? And he mocked Jesus and laughed at Jesus, and the other, it changed them in a positive way. So pain in and of itself doesn't guarantee that a person's going to get honest. For some, it hardens them even more, but for others, it can finally break through. And that's what happened with this one criminal. And I want you to see just what took place in his mind. So in a very short sentence, he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. So I want you to analyze that with me and begin to understand what took place. Before that, he said to the other criminal, stop what you're doing. We deserve what we're getting. This man has done nothing wrong. So what led him to that conclusion? So just before this, he heard Jesus say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. What would he have heard amongst criminals if something unjust happened to them? It would not have been, Father, forgive them. it would have been somebody's going to die. It would have been anger. It would have been revenge. And here he sees Jesus being spit on, laughed at, all kinds of abuse and mistreatment. And Jesus, he's not like the other criminals. Something's different about this guy. He's not lashing out in anger. He's not blaming everybody. He's forgiving people. And he goes, something about this man is attractive. Something about this man is what I want. That kind of character that has this purity, this love, this freedom of bitterness and anger. Wow. And he's drawn to it. And he realizes this is a person who doesn't deserve what's happening to him. He hasn't done anything wrong. And then he goes a little bit further. He starts to say, I deserve what happened to me. And I see it clearly now, so he owns his stuff. So we said that to forgive others, you got to validate your pain. You want to know what you have to do to forgive yourself? You got to validate what you did wrong. You have to own it. You have to be willing to get honest about what you've done. As long as you minimize it, blame others, rationalize it, you're never going to be able to forgive yourself. It starts with owning it. But then he says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he realized that when they called Jesus the Messiah there, the king, this was a king, but he wasn't the king on earth now. He was the king of an afterlife. Because what he's saying is, Jesus, you're going to die, but you're going to go on to your kingdom. So when you die, remember me when you go to the afterlife, where you're going to be king there. And then what he is saying is this, I want you to be my king. I want to be like you. And so when he says, remember me, he's saying, could you forgive me for all I've done? Would you welcome me into your kingdom? Would you be my king and let me be part of what you want to do in your kingdom? Because I want to be with you. I want to be like you. I want to be forgiven. I want to get past and be done with this old way of life. Would you do that for me? And what did Jesus say? Today, you're going to be with me in paradise. Now that is saying, Jesus looked at a man who had been a career criminal. And from what we know of Barabbas, he probably was guilty of murder, all kinds of stuff. He had done some of the worst stuff that humans had done. And Jesus said, I see true repentance in your heart. I see a person that is owning their stuff and getting honest about it. A person who wants to change, who wants a new life, wants to surrender. I forgive. And that is the beauty of the spiritual component when you bring God into it, is he provides a way for us to be forgiven so that we can forgive ourselves. And there's a freedom, there's a joy, there's a load that comes off when we finally experience that isn't matched by anything else.